Hello, Miss. Is that Miss Lincoln? Hello, Miss. Hello, Miss Professor. There we go. voice, I think. Hello, ladies. Well, I was going to wait till 5:40, but most everybody's here. And maybe I'll wait until 5:40. Got 2 more people coming. And I'm assuming people commute. And that's why, that's why you have to deal with the commute to get in. Okay, 5:40. That's what I've been doing anyways. Oops, 5:40. Okie dokie. So I'm going to start, and whoever comes late comes late. Take care of this. Just so you know that this PowerPoint is now on Blackboard. I finished the PowerPoint, so I uploaded it to Blackboard for you. And again, regarding the readings, keep following the schedule for the readings. I'm finding with the readings that not always do, well, just do the readings. Hopefully, hopefully they'll make sense as we go along, but just follow the schedule of the readings. Even though I know that I'm talking about violence, and I should be talking in the schedule, I should be talking about is religion violent, which I will do, but hopefully I'm hoping to finish up violence tonight, and then next week I'll start on is religion violent. But keep doing the readings. So you should be up to the readings with Christopher Hitchens, and what's the reading after that? The reading after that, I think, is an article on Islam and ethics. Gives you a little background about ethical thinking in Islam, how to make ethical decisions. And there's a reading from the Bible, from the New Testament, from Jesus of Nazareth in his famous Sermon on the Mount. So keep doing those readings because they're going to show up on the next quiz. I have 2 questions that I just wrote on my computer while I was waiting. While I was waiting, I was working, And so I wrote 2 questions just about Christopher Hitchens. Only 2 questions. I'm not going to write any more about Christopher Hitchens. But so make sure you're staying up with the readings, or at least you know what's in the reading. If you're a good speed reader, then God bless you. Because sometimes you can just look through the reading quickly and get a sense of it, and that at least will help you answer the question. But make sure you're staying up with the readings. All right. I ended with, yes, Miss Castillo. Is here. Where are you, Miss Castillo? Okay, I was talking about functional bases for violence as opposed to purely organic ones. And I stopped with the frustration-aggression hypothesis. Okay, so just to quickly show organic bases, I talked a little bit about this guy, Conrad Lawrence, and his views about aggression as part of, and violence as part of our genetic makeup. I talked about the autonomic nervous system, sex and gender. And then for functional, I talked about home environment, a good home environment, a bad home environment. And now I stopped with this. And this is the, not the cover page, what would you call it, the dust jacket that someone scanned, which is helpful for me because I wanted to show you a picture of it. But someone scanned of the book Frustration and Aggression. And it was written by a bunch of people. The main person was this man, John Dollard. Could be Dollard, but I'm going to say Dollard. Leonard Doob, Neil Miller, O.H. Maurer, and Robert Sears, in collaboration with a bunch of other people who I guess helped them with their research. Okay, so this I wouldn't say it's a famous book, but it's the book in which this idea, frustration and aggression, gets outlined. Okay, the frustration and aggression hypothesis. I'm going to take my eyeglasses off. I see better close up with them off. Sometimes, at least I read this in one of my sources, and if I look at my footnote here, I guess it was the Dictionary of Anthropology, but so sometimes you might see this, but don't quote me on it. But I saw this in a book, so it sometimes is also called, not the frustration aggression hypothesis, but it's also called the unpleasant mood states. Okay? Can also be called the unpleasant mood states. Put this down. Just in case you come across that statement, you'll know that it's talking about the same thing. Having a state in which you are in an unpleasant mood. I guess someone thought that unpleasant was a better word to use than frustration. And it's more of a mood. Aggression is a mood. It's a kind of attitude that you have in your demeanor, so they chose mood. So unpleasant. So sometimes you might see the same idea, frustration and aggression hypothesis, called unpleasant mood states. But as I was looking and looking even more, and I looked in like the Encyclopedia Britannica, they called it the frustration aggression theory or hypothesis. So I think that probably the frustration aggression hypothesis has stuck, even though sometimes people will call it by this other name. It is a modern account for the source of aggression. It comes from the 1940s, around the time that this book was published. Actually, I shouldn't say 1940s because it was in 1939 the book was published. But it becomes popular in the 1940s, and it derives from this book, Frustration and Aggression, which was published in 1939. So it's 40s-ish, I guess you could say. And it became very popular as an explanation for aggression and violence. And the theory in a nutshell, and I think I already gave you the nutshell version of the theory last week before we left, but I'll say it again. The theory in a nutshell is that aggression results when a person's goals are blocked. Okay? Person, man, woman, has certain goals in his or her life, whether short-term or long-term, and a person, an event, something comes into their life that blocks them from that goal, and the response is aggression, maybe even violence. This group of people that I told you about, Dollard, Doob, Miller, Maurer, Sears, they were a group of Yale psychologists, Yale University in Connecticut, who were led by John Dollard. Presumably that's why his name appears first in the list. Well, it could be alphabetical. Yeah, Dollard, Doob, it could be alphabetical. But nevertheless, they were led by John Dollard, or at least John Dollard is associated with it, and his name is associated with it. So it's rather simple hypothesis. I mean, let's say, just to give you an example. Oh, I didn't realize. Sorry, Mrs. Stork, I just saw that there's a big plastic thing behind you. I didn't realize we had two plastic things. Okay, I didn't even know we were still using them. Okay, anyways. And I got my second booster shot recently, so still have to wear a mask in some places, but we're getting there, I guess. What was I going to say? Oh, just to give you like an example. An example would be, so-and-so works at a company, and that company has a new position opening in the company, and it would be a higher position, it would mean more money, and so this person, let's call this person X, says, I'd really like that job, so I'm going to apply for it internally within the company. But X has a supervisor, Y, who for whatever reason doesn't like X, and gives, or maybe it's just not dislike, it's just the person, whatever, writes a review of the person X, and the review is not a good one. It's a poor review. So the goal is blocked. The person Y does not, or person X, I should say, ends up not getting the position, not chosen for the job within the company because of that poor review by the supervisor, person Y. So one day, person X decides to just go in and punch person Y in the face. Right? Aggression leading to violence. Okay, remember, not all aggression is violence, but sometimes it can be. Why? Why did that happen? And you can sometimes see this in workplace violence. If I want to give you a more serious example, but I didn't want to frighten anybody. But you know about school violence and workplace violence and violence on airplanes, okay, and road rage, violence on highways. What's going on there? Well, if you're following this hypothesis, it's because the person's goal is blocked. Someone cut me off and I feel aggrieved. I wanted to go straight at the same speed, the level of speed that I was going, but this anonymous person swerved right in front of me, cut me off, and not only that, drove slower than the speed limit. Don't you hate those people? I mean, those people, I think there's a special place in hell for those people. Don't you think so, Ms. Marquez?
I have the worst verbiage, so I can't talk.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm sorry. I mean, not trying to poke at a wound, Ms. Marquez, but yeah, you get these people, and they're driving along, speed limit's 60, they're driving along at 50 or something, and they decide they have to pull out in front of you, where you're just not even speeding. I'm going the speed limit, That didn't happen to me today, but it has happened. But my goal was frustrated. So my response was not anger. Oh, well, my response might be anger, but my response was not aggressive. But it can be, and you do have instances where people, drive up to people to yell and scream at them, wave your fist, or sometimes even get more violent. Same thing with, say, workplace violence or bullying in a high school. People feel that people are in their way, and so they do something about it. They show up to school one day and they harm people. So that's a theory. It has been revised since it was first proposed. I mean, as with any good theory, if it's a good theory, then it should be able to withstand criticism. It should even allow itself to be changed in some ways. Okay? Maybe saying that aggression results when a person's goals are blocked was too simplistic. And so the people who proposed the theory and argued for it made a couple of changes. One of those was to say that, pointing out that, well, aggression is only one of the possible responses. It's not the only response, but it is one of the possible responses. Aggression can be brought about through goal frustration. And a second point to be made is that aggression can be reduced as a response or diminished by certain practices. So, for example, vigorous exercise can help to diminish an aggressive response, which I find interesting because when I read the stuff, and maybe you'll remember this from last week, when I read the information about the autonomic nervous system, the whole argument there was that when the autonomic nervous system is, what's the word I'm looking for, becomes excited, the fight or flight, the sympathetic part of the nervous system, becomes excited with its fight or flight mentality, that's when aggressiveness can come out. There's, I think, a decrease in serotonin, if I remember correctly, which also could be connected. I just look at my thing. Good to have. Yeah, it decreases the serotonin, so there's less serotonin. So whatever serotonin is supposed to do in the body, it gives you less of it. Okay, whatever it's supposed to control. And it said, and when I was, looking at the information, it said that things like, say, exercise can increase this aggressiveness, or at least this excitation, the excitement of the autonomic nervous system. So when I read this about maybe you'll see where I'm going with this. When I read this about the frustration-aggression hypothesis, that you could reduce aggression through vigorous exercise, can you really? Because I thought, according to the autonomic nervous system theory, that exciting that part, the sympathetic aspect of the nervous system, through something like exercise actually kind of primed the pump in a way. It makes the autonomic nervous system already willing to respond aggressively. So I have to wonder about that. I'd have to find somebody who knows about this theory and ask them about that. But nevertheless, there it is. It is possible, apparently, to diminish the aggressive response. So those two things. It's only one of possible responses. There are possibilities. It's along a spectrum of responses, aggression being one of them, and aggression can be reduced. Aggression may come directly as retaliation to the object of frustration, which is just a fancy way of, person X goes into work one day and punches person Y in the nose, okay? Person Y and what he or she did is the object of frustration. Person wrote the bad review that made the person not get the job. So the aggression can come directly from that. It's a retaliation against the goal blockage, you might say, the blocking of the goal. But in some cases, no response is possible against the source of frustration. Maybe that's some of the most frustrating forms of aggression that we might have. For example, you can't really retaliate against someone, a person or group that is more powerful than you, like the government. You can sue the government. You might have a wrong that's been committed against you and you sue the government, but it's the government. The government has more lawyers and more money than you and more power. The government appoints the judges. So hopefully you get a fair judge, which I would assume you would. But nevertheless, you never know, depending on times and places. Or it might just be a natural disaster where no one's to blame. It's just an act of God. Well, we blame God, They'll say it's an act of God, okay? It's really an act of nature. I mean, if what do you do with a hurricane that blows down your house? I mean, that's no one's to blame for that. You can't blame Governor Murphy for it. You can't blame President Biden. They didn't build your house. Governor Murphy didn't write the local zoning laws for your town. So it's a natural disaster, and no one's to blame. So there's really in those cases, there's no response possible. What does that mean is that frustration can become displaced. So you're angry about your house being destroyed by a hurricane, which you have nothing you can do. You can't sue the hurricane. So you get angry at the insurance company because they don't want to pay, or they're not paying that as much money as you thought, or not as quickly. Or you have maybe family squabbles because you're worried about the money and how you're going to pay to fix your home. See, the aggression to each other is really you're frustrated about this natural disaster, which you can't retaliate against, really. So the frustration becomes displaced somewhere else. The frustration-aggression hypothesis used to be quite popular, certainly popular apparently in the 40s. I shouldn't say the 40s, that's when around the time it came about. But it used to be a popular explanation, but it has been criticized for being too broadly applied. There's just too broad a theory, some people thought. An American psychologist named Abraham Maslow, interesting. Abraham Maslow, for example, studied this theory. American psychologist studied the theory, and he said that legitimate interferences, actually legitimate frustrations, do not necessarily produce frustration. Oh, I shouldn't have said frustrations, but legitimate or justified interferences, things that get in the way, blockages that are legitimate, do not necessarily produce frustration. Why? Because they're legitimate and people understand why they're there. So, for example, I may want to, continuing my driving example, I may want to drive 80 miles or 90 miles per hour or whatever miles per hour I want to. However, there are speed limits posted. Those are blocking that goal. But they're interferences with my goal, which is to drive as fast as I judge I should be able to drive, or I am able to drive my car. And they are legitimate interferences. I mean, people might gripe about them, but accept that they are legitimate. You can try to argue it with the judge about your traffic ticket, but you're going to lose. I mean, you're probably going to lose. You're going to probably end up paying, but you can try to argue philosophically about the need or the legitimacy of speed limits in a democracy. But yeah, elected officials or people who are put into position by elected officials make decisions on, how fast people should generally be allowed to drive on a certain area of road. But it might produce frustration, but it's a legitimate interference. It might not produce any frustration. Okay, I see I'm going 65, now the speed limit's 55. All right, so I have to reduce my speed. Do I want to? No, maybe not really. I'd like to get home more quickly. But that's the speed limit, so I reduce my speed. And that's it. There's no frustration. I'm not going crazy and angry. It seems for Maslow, in regards to blocking goals, only those things that blocked or interfered illegitimately seem to lead to frustration. So things that were arbitrary or unfair or unjustified, okay? That seems to lead to frustration. When people don't understand when or why you're asking them to do something that's going to make them have to not be able to do something. Like, and I probably shouldn't use an example of the COVID, but anyways. But I mentioned the fact, yes, I have 2 COVID vaccinations, 2 boosters, and many months ago I actually had the virus, so I was sick with it. So that I have the natural immunity on top of that. So all these things, and as I said, still go places and you have to wear a mask. Why? I'm not trying to be a denier. I'm not a COVID denier, but I'm just asking, why am I doing it here and everywhere? Like, I shouldn't say everywhere else, but the great majority of places it's either optional or no. We don't care, which is basically saying the same thing as optional. If you want to wear it, fine. If you still feel it, whatever. Is it arbitrary? I'm not saying it's not, but I can it's just an example. Just an example I'm using. Okay? I'm not making any statement or I'm not ranting. This is an example. All right? If people feel a law or something is arbitrary or it's unfair, it's not being applied fairly to everybody, like, for example, well, we just kind of accept this, but it's just the way it is, I guess. The police. The police never get traffic tickets. I shouldn't say never say never. But a police officer, either on duty or off duty, is not likely to get a traffic ticket from another police officer if the police officer knows that it's another police officer. Whereas I might. Okay. I have a cousin who's a police officer, and she gets little cards every year from the Police Benevolent Association. And get your little, I do not use them. I say I'm not interested in them. Thank you very much. I appreciate that she hands them out, but she gives them out to family members, and you keep them in your wallet. And you can flash them to a police officer if you get pulled over. These things happen, everyone knows that they happen. Someone's printing up the cards for them. So someone might say that's an unfair application of the law. So it might cause frustration and aggression in people, anger, if they know that that's going on. Because then it makes the speed limit seem like it is an illegitimate interference. It applies to me, but it doesn't apply to this small group of people, including, say, politicians, like I mentioned Governor Murphy before, or the president. If they need to get somewhere, they get there fast. I have to sit in traffic. And I understand. I'm not the leader of the free world. I understand. At least in my self-published comic book, I am. President Maddie. Anyways, let's go on to my next sentence. Anyways. And Maslow's research showed that aggressive behavior was the prevalent response, not the only response, but it was prevalent when people thought that there were deliberate or unfair efforts to interfere with my goal attainment. So going back to my other example of the supervisor who puts in a poor evaluation. Now, person X could say, well, maybe it doesn't have an aggressive response. Well, maybe I was off that month. I just was not doing a good job. I knew that I had some issues and they came back to bite me. I got a poor evaluation. There was no malice. And maybe you're friends with person Y and there was no malice in the report. So there's no opportunity. Your goal has been interfered with, but you're not aggressive about it. Whereas if it was totally unfair, like the supervisor wanted to keep you in your job, maybe because you're good at it, and the supervisor likes that, can keep you doing your job, makes the supervisor look good, then that's totally unfair. Then yeah, you might be really angry, and it might start to foster a really aggressive response, especially if you think it's a deliberate or unfair effort to interfere with your goal attainment. Another psychologist, Leonard Berkowitz, a social psychologist, so kind of like a sociologist who's also a psychologist, studies basically social interactions. Leonard Berkowitz came at it from another point of view. Berkowitz, and you can kind of see the name. Let me just turn this. See it any better? Now I have to put my eyeglasses on. Can't. Sorry, I'm looking at my little. I do it like that. Okay. Now I have to take them off. Driving me nutso. There we go. Okay. Let's see here. Can you still see me? Yeah, you can pretty much still see me. Okay. American social psychologist Leonard Berkowitz, in his studies, showed that frustration creates only a predisposition to aggression. Okay? It doesn't actually create aggression. The only way that aggression occurs is when it occurs to the extent that there are negative emotions produced. So this is kind of a little different from the revision of the frustration-aggression hypothesis. In the revision, they said that, well, aggression is only one of possible responses that occurs to goal blockage. But Berkowitz seems to be saying that, well, no, only to the extent that there's a negative emotion produced will you actually have the production of aggression. Actual aggression will occur. Oh, excuse me, I just said that. Sorry. Frustration, the frustration in the frustration-aggression hypothesis leads to a fight or flight response. Kind of like, again, in the sympathetic aspect of the autonomic nervous system, that controls the fight or flight response. And remember, it's fight or flight. Fight meaning aggression, aggressiveness, but also flight, which means going away, removing yourself from the situation. Either one is an option. Either one is selectable, able to be selected or chosen. You can choose to be aggressive, you can choose not to be aggressive. Those are options. And so the choice of whether a person chooses to be aggressive or not is based on the intensity of the negative emotion, as well as the interpretation of the situation. So if the negative emotion is strong enough and the situation is right enough or wrong enough, one might say, then it may lead to aggression. So if I'm at a club and the bouncer won't let me in, if the bouncer, okay, fine, fight or flight, I can leave. He's not going to let me in. I'm not cool. I know I'm not cool. I never have been. But if he insults me on the way, then that might change my response from flight to now I'm going to fight with the guy because he's being mean to me. There's a negative emotion there. But also I have to interpret the situation. I mean, if I look at the guy and he's someone like me, then maybe I can take him, or get in his face. But if he's like one of these hulkish guys, like some kind of professional wrestler type, who's like 8 feet tall and has immense muscles, then I might be like, you know what? He ticked me off with his comment, but I'm still going to turn around and walk away. Because Maddie is not a fighter. All right. Here are a couple of diagrams that I got off the internet to just show these two ideas in play. The one up here is Dollard et alia. Et alia is just a Latin phrase for and others, because I didn't want to write down all the other names of the people who helped him write the book, the other scientists. So Dollard, the frustration-aggression hypothesis, and then Leonard Berkowitz's version of it. Okay, so you have a goal that needs to be won. There's an obstacle to that goal which produces frustration. Okay, and the frustration can lead to aggression, and the response to the aggression seems to determine whether the aggression continues or not, or it goes away. So if there's punishment for the aggression, then it leads back to frustration. So that's interesting. So it can become like a cycle, a vicious circle, as they say. You keep getting punished and getting frustrated again because you keep getting punished for trying to get what you want. If you have success, if aggression leads to success, then you have what's called catharsis. Catharsis is just a fancy Greek word for to be released. Find release from the pressure of the frustration. It's now released, and you kind of see this idea at play, no pun intended, in play, when you have, say, parents have a child who is an aggressive type. or who is very agitated or energetic, and someone will tell them, oh, get her into sports. Put them in sports. Put her on the, soccer or football, or play, baseball or softball. I don't know why they always put girls into softball. I don't know why they can't play baseball too. But anyways, but find a sport. No, I'm just saying. I mean, I'm not, it just seems like gender rolling people, It's like, oh no, women don't play baseball. Well, yeah, they kind of can. Huh?
Baseball scares me.
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
Why does it scare you?
I don't know. The ball is so tiny, but it's so much faster.
That's why I stopped. I loved it growing up, but then I got scared. I was afraid I was going to get hit by the ball. But anyway, but you get my point. People kind of see that sports will give a catharsis, a release to the aggression that the child is showing. So let's provide that outlet. Okay? The same thing might be for to just not use the sports analogy, but a child that seems to need a lot of attention, is always performing in a way. And you say, well, let's get the kid involved in acting or something, or music or some, stuff like that, so that there's a catharsis rather than having the person have constant frustration and possibly responding aggressively to it. We get a success and catharsis. The person goes out on stage and realizes he's a performer. Maybe in another life. But then we got Leonard Berkowitz. And what does he say here? Frustration, the blocking of a goal, increased arousal, anger. But the increased arousal or anger has two options here. If there are more aggressive cueing, then that could lead to aggression. I mean, if the door is open for the aggression to come out, okay, like the bouncer at the club is looking for a fight, and is giving, like pushing me, starts pushing me and stuff like that. Those are aggressive cues. Okay, but if there are none, then there's less likelihood. So, if the bouncer is just like, hey, dude, I'm sorry, it's full. It's just we can't go over capacity. There's too many people, so that's it for tonight. We're not letting anyone else in. Okay, fine. Polite and nice and helpful and informative. Okay, thank you, Mr. Bouncer. And I go on my merry way. I go to a nice Indian restaurant that's open all night.
Where?
Tell me.
I would like to know.
Anyways, so this is his kind of version of the frustration-aggression hypothesis, that there is frustration, but it doesn't necessarily need to lead to aggressiveness, but if it does lead to aggressiveness, it's usually because aggression is thrown at it and is offered on a plate, if you will, to the person, and they take it off the plate. Yes, do I want some aggression? I've got some aggression. I'll take some more. Thank you very much. And then a fight ensues. So what does this, let me just go to my next thing, integrity. Okay. So what does this have to do with violence, Dr. Dunn? This is the question I wrote down for myself. Well, all of this gets us closer to an understanding of what violence really is. And we are getting to the definition of violence itself. In the same way that there's a lot of build up to the definition of religion. What do we know from all of this? We've talked about aggression and force and power. Violence, what distinguishes violence from aggression? Because not all aggression is violence, but all violence is aggression. Violence at its core, in its essence, is destructive. Destructive. I would say that's what really distinguishes violence from anything else. Destruction of person, of life. It is harmful. It causes injury. Aggression doesn't necessarily do that. I mean, aggression is the threat of causing injury, but I don't have to. I'm just threatening it. Force Force is, what is force? Let me go back to my definition. Force is exerting control on someone or something, but, I'm not necessarily exerting control necessarily in a painful or a violent way. I don't necessarily have to do that. Sometimes it's just the force of personality. Mommy told me to clean up my room, so I clean up my room. Or Daddy told me to look both ways when I come to a street. Okay, look for cars. Okay, so I do that. Why? Mommy told me. Daddy told me. They use power, their ability to control. Well, they had the ability, but they used force in the sense, but the force of their authority, which was legitimate, because they're parents. They should be looking out for the child. They should be trying to teach the child life skills. Okay. So violence causes harm or injury, and it offends against the integrity of someone or something. And this, because I use it, just give you a definition of it. You can see it there. 1 second, I just want to check one thing myself. Yeah, it's fine. Could put control into that definition, not just energy. Well, whatever. Integrity, okay? Being whole or complete. That's all integrity means. To say that someone has integrity means that they are complete in and of themselves. They are, in a sense, perfect. I know we don't really use it exactly that way when we say a person has integrity, but usually in a way we kind of do, because we kind of mean that the person has all those qualities, those good qualities we would expect. The person is truthful and just, that are prudent, respectful, etc. and so forth. Not good qualities that we would expect, and has them all. So you still have that idea of completeness, entirety. It comes from the Latin word integer, which means exactly that, entire. This is where we get the word entire from. Again, you can thank Anglo-French for this one, I think. Entire, which is basically integer. Whole, actually, this is, well, I know it's better than that. Complete, there should be a comma here, excuse me. Complete, perfect, which all mean basically the same thing, just different shades of meaning. Okay? And violence destroys that. Violence destroys integrity. It is destructive of that. Would anyone like to read this definition from the World Health Organization? Anybody? Oh, yes, thank you.
The intentional use of physical force or power threatened or action against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation.
Excellent. You see, it comes from the World Health Organization, from its, I'll get my footnote here. The World Health Organization Global Consultation on Violence and Health, and their document, Violence, a Public Health Priority, which was published in the 1996. And it is quoted in Carlson's article, Carlson, Religion and Violence Coming to Terms with Terms. So I went and I looked it up and found it and tracked it down and put it here on the PowerPoint with the source. Okay? This is the definition that the World Health Organization uses for violence. And I mean, you can kind of tell that it was written by a committee because it's rather broad, and Carlson actually criticizes it for that. It's not a bad definition, Carlson says, John Carlson, in his article, Religion and Violence Coming to Terms with Terms, in Blackwell Companion to Religion and Violence. It's not a bad definition. It's not a poor one. It serves its purpose for what the World Health Organization wants to do, which is to address violence, using people hitting people, shooting people, killing people, but it also wants to include maybe subtler forms of violence like starvation, people not having enough food to eat, not having jobs, not having proper education, stuff like that. So it wants to include those as well. And to that extent, Carlson thinks that the definition might be a little bit broad, and I agree with him. It's a little bit too broad, because I think it can include things as violence that probably are more aggression than violence, and probably are bad things, but are not really violence. Violence is not a good thing necessarily. It depends on the context. You know, if I go and murder somebody with violence, obviously the context is bad. But if I have to kill someone who is trying to murder another person, I mean kill because that's the only way to do it. It doesn't, maybe if I could subdue the person, then I should, I think, morally. But if I can't, the only way to stop it is to do something that might cause the harm or death of the person. Again, the context, it's killing, which is not a good thing. It's violence, but it's, in a sense, kind of a good violence in that way. It's a justifiable violence. Like when a police officer has to defend himself by shooting someone. Or a soldier. Maybe a soldier is a better example. If it's in the state of war and the enemy's coming towards him and he knows that they're going to kill me if I don't defend myself. So he defends himself. And maybe his intent is not even to kill the other person, but to stop the other soldier. But there's that possibility of deadly force. So it's violence, but not all. You have to sometimes consider the context in violence. There are some things that are bad that just because they're bad doesn't mean they're violence, and I'll explain that more later as I move on. So there are issues to this definition that I have that Carlson does not mention. And just some of the questions, I'm just going to tell you some of the questions that popped into my mind when reading this definition from the World Health Organization. Why is it intentional? It says it's the intentional use of physical force or power. What about a person who just lashes out? All right, it's impulsive violence, but that's not intentional. I mean, yes, there is intentional violence where I plan to go get a weapon and then go somewhere and use the weapon on somebody with full intent, that's intentional. But what if someone just has poor motor control, or they have low impulse control? There are people who have that. And they might not even intend it. I mean, sometimes they might, that if a person gets aroused enough and angry enough that they do get violent, they get very aggressive. Like a person, there are some people, you might notice that some people who have mental illness, that's an issue. Like with schizophrenics, they just more and more stimulus, they get more stimulus and can become very aggressive. Maybe without completely intending it, but the brain is broken. It's a psychosis. So the brain is, on overdrive of aggression, and they lash out, and it's not intended. Or you just have reflex problems. There are people who there are genetic disorders where, and also diseases that people have where they move. And what if I move my hand and I just happen to hit somebody in the face and slap them? Completely unintended, but it might be a medical condition. So I'm not sure that, you have to say that it's the intentional use of physical force, because it's still violence. You still hit the person, or you still maybe injured the person. Say if you're a schizophrenic who is just going crazy, because of overstimulation. That's possible. I don't see that. I think that there's no need for the use of the word intentional, and also why physical violence. Because it does talk about psychological harm at the bottom. It talks about resulting in injury, death, psychological harm. Also, why death specifically? I mean, injury, death, why not just injury? Why not just harm itself? Injury can be it's broad enough to include just short-term injury, like, someone hit me and I have a bruise on my body. or someone broke a bone or something, but it could also include death. I don't know why they have to be so specific about death there. They do mention psychological harm, but they say physical force or power. Why physical? Why does that also include emotional trauma? Think of the picture I showed you of the two parents screaming at the child. If a person is in an abusive relationship where every time the person does something wrong, the person gets yelled at, screamed at, or not even screamed at, just a nasty comment's made over and over again. And that's a big indicator for mental illness in children, because children really are like sponges, and everything is about them. Everything is about them. They're complete narcissists. Okay? Until they start getting a lot older and start realizing that they're not the only things in existence. But in the very early ages of children, they're narcissists, 100%. So if a parent is constantly telling, and everything's about them, even though it might have nothing to do with them. So if a parent is constantly telling a child, why would you do that? You're so stupid. And the parent might not think anything of it. It's just a throwaway comment. But the child, it's everything. And if it's said enough, it can be the basis for mental illness in the child as the child grows up. So that's not physical force. The parent isn't physically beating the words into the brain of the child. Parents just saying it, speaking it, and maybe not even yelling it, just whispering it so the child can hear. Why would you do that? Why do you always do that? You're so dumb. And you can barely hear it maybe, but the child hears it enough for the child to hear. So I don't understand the use of physical force in this definition. I don't understand the use of the word physical, because emotional trauma, I think, is just as harmful. And it also does not take into account the cultural differences that there are in the world. It's kind of a Western view that everything has to be physical and material. But there are other cultures where, yes, there can be physical violence, but there's also mental violence, like using witchcraft and sorcery. Okay? And I lived in a country, for 9 months I lived in a country, Papua New Guinea, which is just above the continent of Australia, if you look on a map. Actually, I'll show you. Google Maps. Okay. Take a moment. Okay. Have a good time. There we go. If we go to the west, go all the way down here in the world, bottom of the world almost, pretty much. You have this huge continent of Australia, huge. Very few people live there. If I remember the population, I think it's around 20 million at this point. I want to say 18 million, but I think it's around 20 million now. But this Australia is as large as the 48 contiguous United States. So from California, think of California over here, and all the way over to where we are in New Jersey up here. And it's just totally barren. There's almost nobody living in most of the country. Most of the people live here on the eastern coast. All right. And right above, you just follow this little, like a pointing finger, you come to the independent state of Papua New Guinea, which is a very beautiful country, but also a very third world country. It's a nice enough country. It's peaceful enough. They don't have I don't think they've had any real coups d'etats or anything that you have to worry about, but it's not the safest place in the world to live. And while I was there, one of the big pushes, and there were posters, I didn't take pictures, unfortunately, because I didn't think of just didn't think of it while I was there. But I mean, I remember at the place I was teaching, the school I was teaching, right on the, I think it was the door to the library, because I also worked in the library while I was there. They had a big government poster against witchcraft. They had to institute a law about witchcraft so that people making it a crime to kill witches, because sorcery and witchcraft are very big in the culture, and people can't necessarily explain. Well, they don't really explain illness in Western terms a lot of times. A lot of times people aren't sure why someone died. Now, we could have done an autopsy and found out the person died from cancer, or the person died from, I don't know, a weak heart or something. But when you don't know, when you don't have those tools, people come up with other explanations. And what other explanations are there? Well, the witch in the village. You know, he made her, remember like 3 months ago when he made her angry? She said that she would get him for it. And then 3 months later, you know, he drops like a nail. Boom! On the ground, he's dead. Well, I mean, what's the only reasonable explanation? She must have put a curse on him. And so the town members go over to the witch's house and they kill her. You have to kill the witch so that she won't put a curse on you. That's a form of mental violence. The sorcerer is not physically doing anything. And the witch, and I'm not saying that the witches are like nice people either, you know, because they might believe that they have that mental power as well. That if they say certain words and they do certain things, they can cause illness and sickness to people. So I'm not saying like it's like all good on all sides. But the government wants to stamp this down, you know, stop people from taking the law into their own hands and killing women for being witches in Papua New Guinea. It is an issue. So that's a form of mental violence. I mean, the witch or the sorceress is not physically doing anything to anybody. She's not taking a knife and going to kill the person. She's saying her incantations or the spells that she knows and, you know, doing whatever, certain rituals. And she believes that they have a certain spiritual aspect, which will cause things. Maybe negative things. Okay? So, again, I think saying that it has to be physical force or power is showing kind of a Western cultural viewpoint by the World Health Organization. And why is it threatened? Okay? Why do they have to specify it's the intentional use of physical force, threatened or actual? Again, I would say that's aggression. Threatened violence is aggression. It's not necessarily violence. Is every aggressive act necessarily violent? Which comes back to my point that I've been talking about last class, and so now. I would say no. And that's all I have to say about the definition. According to this person's a theologian who teaches now at Duquesne University, which Duquesne in Ohio, or I want to say Pennsylvania. I think Duquesne University is in Pennsylvania. Anyways, Darlene Fozard Weaver. Darlene Fozard. I think it's Fozard and not Fozard. Darlene Fozard Weaver. I found something interesting that she wrote. She wrote a chapter for a textbook I once used called Introduction to Religious Studies. In fact, I referred to it way back at the beginning because the editor of that textbook was basically the one who said, well, we can't really give a definition of religion, nor should we want to. And that, of course, set me off at the beginning of the course, which is why I felt I needed to speak so much about what is religion. How can you write a textbook on religious studies and then open it with saying that, well, we shouldn't even try to define it. Like, okay, fine. Well, close the book then and give me my money back. Full money, not textbook return money. I want my full money back, not 70% or something of the cost. That's all right. I got an exam copy because I'm a professor. That's how you get free stuff. Anyway. So Darlene Fozard Weaver wrote the chapter on violence and religion in this textbook. And she described, and I thought this was a good short definition of what violence is. It's not the definition I'm going to give you, but I think it's a good short definition of what violence is. Violence is basically the destructive exercise of power. I guess that's quote unquote. The destructive exercise of power. I would change that a little bit. I would say it's the destructive use of force. She says the destructive exercise of power. But I understand she's using the word power in the sense of control. And I'm using it in a broader sense of having the ability to do something, to affect something. What did I say? Destructive use of force? Yeah. Because I think it's more force that we're talking about than power. Because use of force. That's how I would change it. So this is her, and this is me. And I use use because, exercise and use really mean the same thing. You could just say the destructive use of power, okay? But it's the destructive exercise. You could say the destructive exercise of force, okay? It's a handy-dandy, short Cliff's Notes version of what violence is. It's the destructive exercise of power, the destructive use of force, emphasis on the destructive aspect. So here you go. A form of aggression that uses the power of force to cause injury. So the power that I have, the ability that I have to impose my energy, my will, you could say, on something to cause injury, cause harm. The word violence, comes from the Latin word vis. And no, this is not a mistake. Vis, vis, vires, because it changes. Vis is the noun form. Vis is the possessive form. The possessive form, and vires is the plural form. Okay? And what does it mean? I mean, literally, violence means something. It's rooted in this word vis, which means strength, force, vigor, power, or energy. And shock. Thought that was interesting. Shock. But you get the sense of energy and power and force. Strengthfulness. John Carlson points out in his article about religion and violence coming to terms with terms, that vis captures the empirical or the effectual meaning of violence, particularly the subject's experience of it. So that's a quotation from him. I'll read it again. He points out that vis, quote, captures the empirical means experience, the experiential aspect, okay? The empirical or effectual to bring something about, okay? Meaning of violence, particularly the subject's experience of it. Okay, so the subject is the I, the doer, okay? And so vis brings out the power that is exerted by me in violence. I am exerting my force on someone else or something else. Interesting. Really should say the patient's experience of it, but whatever. It's a little philosophical quibble there. So the focus is on the experience of the violence as energy. It's the energy of the person who is imposing it on somebody or something else. So the empirical view, the experience of violence. And you might say that with vis, energy, force, strength, the primary reference point is the recipient of the force, the victim. Then you have the victim. Okay? Again, and I have to look this up, but I think it's true. Victim also has its root in this word vis, as someone who is the recipient of the strength or the force or the energy. And so we have related. Oh, okay, I didn't do that. I guess I'll write it on the board then. So we have a related term, to violate. Talking about violence. Well, there are a bunch of related terms. Violence, violent, violate, violator, etc. So, but this word violate is actually quite interesting for our purposes of the course, for its connection to religion and violence. Violo, violare, violavi, violatus, violatum. I don't think anyone here took Latin, but if you did, you could give me a shout out. Violo. Why did you put on a PowerPoint? But I apologize for that. Which means to treat with violence. So to violate. To treat with violence. Violo. Whoops. Treat with violence. What readings does it have? To injure. To dishonor. Well, I'll leave that for last. To break. And this last one, which I think is very interesting for our purposes, to profane. Actually, I'll put a box around it because yes, I hear you. To profane. Okay, let's take our break then and see you in 10 minutes. Oh. That's right. I snoozed it. Turn it off. I snoozed it. Right. Oh. Shut up. Alrighty, I'm going to begin again where I left off with violo. To profane. Now, if we go back, remember when I talked about the sacred and the profane, remember the sacred was what happened inside of the temple, the phanum, yes? And in front of the phanum, whatever was outside, pro-phanum, was considered normal and everyday. Okay, it's profane, it's not sacred, so it's normal in a way. But what was sacred is not normal, and that's what goes on in the sacred places like a temple. So to violate something means to profane it, to take something which is sacred and to treat it as if it's normal, as it's an everyday item. So again, we see the presence, or I should maybe not again, but in this word, in violence, we see the presence of religion. But in an opposite way, not in the sense of religion performing violence, but as violence being done to religion, profaning it. It's a matter of something bad, violation, being done to a religious person or object. So as an attack against the sacred, violence is by its definition anti-religious. You're profaning the sacred. You're doing something bad to it. So by definition, violence is actually anti-religious. And one could say that to commit violence in the name of religion is a kind of existential suicide. I mean, it makes no sense for a religious person to be violent. I mean, they can be violent and have been violent. Religious people have done violence. And done violence for religious reasons. But it's like a form of suicide because it's actually the word violo, from which we get violate, which is related to the word violence, is an attack on religion. You're actually attacking yourself by violating, by being violent. What are the types of violence? Well, the types of violence, I think, are pretty obvious. This is again according to the World Health Organization's report on violence and health. You know, what do you have? You have physical violence, obviously, things that are physically done to one person to another, or physically done to oneself, like suicide. But you also have psychological violence, which you could also call mental violence or emotional violence. And then you have a third kind of violence, which they didn't really give a name to in the report, but I'm calling it passive-aggressive violence. This is where deprivation comes in, neglect. If we go back to the previous definition here, where they talk about maldevelopment and deprivation, that's where passive-aggressive violence would come in, where a parent refuses to take care of a child, or a society refuses to educate its children, or to make sure that people have proper work so they can support themselves, or whatever. These would be forms of passive-aggressive violence. They're not actively, physically doing violence, and they're not actively doing emotional violence to people, but they just don't care. You know, and that lack of care provides suffering and harm. It's destructive. So physical violence is most obviously physical, material damage. It causes pain. Okay, physical violence causes physical pain. It's material damage to another. And physical violence can be directed towards people, animals. It can also be directed towards things or property or groups of people as well. It can also be directed against yourself, and suicide is considered also a form of violence. I'm not sure what I think about that one, because again, suicide is certainly I should say it's a form of destruction. So okay, fine, I'll just go with it. Psychological violence aims, again, to damage. It is destructive, but it is destructive on the emotional well-being of a person. It aims to evoke harmful or destructive emotions. And psychological violence applies principally to persons. But it could also be applied to other things, other beings that are worthy of respect, like animals, Okay, people can treat animals harshly and with psychological violence and harm to the extent that animals have emotions. Of course, we don't know definitively because we can't ask them what they're feeling and they can't talk to us, or we don't speak their language and they don't speak ours. But, you can kind of tell sometimes when an animal has been beaten or treated very badly, the demeanor is different. The demeanor, it's not a happy one might say. You can tell when an animal is sad or is feeling oppressed. Passive-aggressive violence, as I described, is a kind of reverse of inflicting harm. It's harm that's inflicted by inaction rather than taking action. In other words, one is refusing to act when the person is obliged to, like a parent that refuses to feed his or her child. Violence causes injury. Injury. And what is injury? It's any action that causes harm or damage to another. Could be another person, could be another being like an animal, but injury. And it comes from the Latin word injuria, so it's pretty much the same, injury, injuria. But the basis of the Latin word injuria is the word jus. Use. And use has the meaning of what it is binding for someone to do, an obligation. You could also translate this as law, okay? But what is binding to do, what is right, just, or one has a duty to do, an obligation, a use. So, violence based on this, one can say that violence is a form not just of destructive damage, but it is in a form of injustice. It's a form of injustice, because that's where we get justice from. Justitia in Latin, based on this word use, is where you're doing what you're bound to do. That's what the virtue justitia. The virtue of justice is to give someone or something what it is owed to it. And if you remember from one of our early readings, I asked you to read from a man named Thomas Aquinas, and also from two authors, McHugh and Callan, I forget their first names, where they talked about religion. Yes, they talked about it from a very religious perspective, the Catholic religion. But the point of the reading that I wanted you to get from was it was also a very philosophical discussion of what religion is. And they were delving into kind of deeper currents of philosophy than just Catholicism. And in its essence, religion is a form of the virtue of justice, if you remember. Okay? Well, please remember, because it will come up on the final exam. So justice, justitia. Okay, so to do something that you are not obliged, or to do to not do what you are obligated to do is a form of injustice. And because violence causes injury, it means you're not doing what you are obligated to do towards another, which is to treat people with respect, to respect the integrity of their person, not harm them, not try to harm them, okay? And so violence becomes a form of injustice. An injury, an injuria, is anything that is done contrary to justice. That's how it was understood in Latin and in Roman law, an injury. And it's still understood this way. I mean, if any of you are doing paralegal studies or you're in the pre-law program or thinking of it, lawyers talk about this. They talk about if an injury, people are caused injuries. And an injury does not mean a physical injury necessarily. It's an injustice. So if I work at a job and they refuse to pay me, okay, and the money that is owed to me for the work I did, then I can go to a lawyer and that's an injury. I can sue them. That's why you have the process of suing. I take them to court to get the money because they have injured me. If someone goes around telling lies about me and they know they are lies, and I'm not a public figure, although maybe the courts would define me as a public figure, but I'm a private citizen, I'm not a public figure, and the person telling lies, my reputation has been injured. I am not getting the due respect due to my name that is due it. So an injury is contrary to justice. Now, so all forms of violence are injustice. All forms. This is like my previous statement about all forms of violence are aggression, but not all forms of aggression are violence. All forms of violence are injustice, but not all injustices are violent. Not all forms of injustice are violence. We need to be careful about this, because I think some people try to broaden violence to include any and every kind of bad, unjust behavior. Yes, if it's violent, then it is unjust. But something can be unjust and not be violent. Like my employer who's denying me my just wages is committing an injury against me. It's an injustice, but it's not violent. The person's not physically harming me, not even mentally harming me. Maybe you could say passive-aggressively harming me. I have to think about that one. But that's different where if I am physically harmed, I'm attacked. That is not just violence, but it's an injustice against me because it's destroying my integrity, the integrity of my body. And I have the right not to have the integrity of my body taken from me. Unless I allow it to be, like if I have to go into surgery, and the doctor has to cut me open. Well, that's a different situation, obviously. Yes?
Can you repeat the statement, all forms of violence are...
Yes. All forms of violence are injustice.
What was the other one, but not all?
I got you. I'm coming back to you. I just wanted to let it sink in, Ms. O'Connor. All forms of violence are injustice, but not all forms of injustice are violence. Not all forms of injustice are violence. Why? Because violence, by definition, is injustice. It causes injury. And as I just taught you, inuria at its base is about justice, jus, justitia. Okay? But not everything that's unjust is necessarily violent. Remember the definition of violence. The definition of violence is aggression that is using force to cause injury. Okay? There can be forms of injustice that are still injustice, still bad, not good, but they're not using force to cause injury. They're not aggressively trying to cause injury or damage. I just think you have to be careful about this because, for example, going back to Darlene Fozard, well, she's not on the board anymore, I erased her name, but Darlene Fozard Weaver in that same book chapter from Introduction to Religious Studies she talks about interpersonal violence, and it's not just quote, deliberate and over, I'm quoting her, deliberate and over infliction of physical, as well as emotional, psychological, and spiritual harm. Okay? But it is also harming others through unjustly, now listen to this list of stuff, through unjustly acquiring or damaging property, or by restricting or denying people's access to resources essential for human life and well-being, for instance, food and water. Okay. Now, so let me just repeat what she says, that she's talking about interpersonal violence, violence between persons, and it's not just the physical harm or the emotional injury, the psychological injury, but it includes taking people's stuff, taking their property, or by, denying their access to essential resources, none of which is good. I mean, the latter things like denying people's access to essential resources or taking people's property unjustly, I'm not saying those are good things. Those are certainly unjust and wrong, but are they really violence? If you do it with violence, like you send in people with clubs to beat people to take their land from them, then yeah, I would say that's certainly violence. But if not, I would say we have to be careful. Remember, the World Health Organization definition includes deprivation and neglect as forms of violent acts. Again, depriving people and neglecting people, especially like children, that's wrong and unjust, but is it violence? And we need to see, I think, violence for what it really is. We need to take violence seriously for violence so we can really recognize it when we see it, and not just use it as a synonym for words like bad, anything we don't like. It makes me feel bad, or what they did to you was bad, therefore it becomes violence automatically. Okay, well, we have to kind of sometimes declutter our definitions and make them very clear. And that's not saying that what someone might have done to someone else was not unjust, unfair, or wrong, or evil. But it might be those things, but it might not be violent. You have to be careful about it, I think. What is the intent? Oh, I'm going to skip over this thing, and I'm going to skip over these. Yeah, so skip over these. Okay. What are kinds of violence? Well, I already told you. I'm not sure how to define this, because we had kinds of violence. We had types of violence: physical, mental, passive aggressive. But then the World Health Organization also even kind of drills down deeper, and there are types of violence depending on who it's directed towards. I've already kind of mentioned this, so I guess I can go through it quickly. There's self-directed violence, which is, one person doing violence to himself or herself, something like suicide or cutting, stuff like that. That's self-directed violence. The most common form, I think, in my opinion, is the second form, which is interpersonal violence, which is one person to another. And then the third form, probably the second most common, I guess, would be collective violence, which is a group of unrelated people or groups of people doing it to each other. Okay, so like mob violence. So as I mentioned, self-directed violence would be something like suicide. An example of interpersonal violence might be between family members, domestic abuse, or between intimate partners. Okay, we used to call them boyfriends and girlfriends, but I guess now we're saying intimate partners, and who knows what we'll say 20 years from now. It'll be something even, an external possible mate with benefits. I don't know. Who knows? But intimate partner violence, and that's not in any way to diminish. I shouldn't say that. I'm not joking about that. But yeah, in between people who are one-on-one violence, people who are in a relationship of some sort. It could be a family relationship, but it could be just any intimate relationship, not necessarily sexual. They could be friends at some time. And collective violence, as I said, between groups of individuals. But collective violence could also include nation states, like countries going to war against each other. I'll bring this up because you might hear about it sometimes. All right, I'll skip this. I'll get right straight to the definition. I'm going to cut some things out because I have too much, but that's okay. You're not missing anything. I shouldn't say that because it makes me feel like it's not really important information, but it's not as important, I guess. So I'll just cut to the chase. Structural violence. You might hear about this term, structural violence. Okay, and this is one where, again, I think you have to be, it's an important concept, but I think you have to be careful, again, about broadening the definition of violence so much that it's everything. And when something becomes everything, then it really kind of becomes nothing. You don't know what it is anymore. So I think you need to be careful with it. So structural violence is a form of aggression because it's violence in a social system or group. And in that social system or group, violence or the threat of violence is an essential part of maintaining the system. especially as it abuses and oppresses others within that system. So that's what structural violence is. Okay? You could also call it social violence. So it's a distinct form of violence where the systems that are created, the societal systems that we're a part of, are created in such a way as to physically threaten people to kind of keep in line and to support the system. Otherwise, they'll be punished, even though the system itself is unjust. So they're cultural systems or institutional systems that oppress individuals and groups. A very obvious example from our own history as a country would be the practice of slavery. Okay, which, if you just read a little bit of history of slavery, America was not the biggest group of slavers in the world. For slavery, you'd have to look at places like Brazil, which had us beat when it came to slavery, places in South America. However, difference. In the United States, especially in the southern United States, it was an institution. It was seen as something that was part of the society. I mean, the society was stratified. It was like a layered cake. And you had whites on the top, they had the white frosting on the top, baby. And then you had the black part of the cake all the way at the bottom. And that's the way it was supposed to stay. And whites in power would do everything they could, from the judges to the legislatures to the governors of the states, do whatever they could to keep that system of power in place. And of course, when blacks said, hey, we're Americans too, this is our country too, we have rights under the Constitution too, no you don't, no you don't, no you don't, at every level. Just tell them, the governor would say, nope, I don't, no, get back to work, slave. The people in the legislature would pass laws so that blacks couldn't vote, or they make all sorts of tests that make it hard for blacks to vote. And then, of course, you had the judicial system, which is supposed to read the law and to read it fairly for all people. That would say when it's a white person in front of them, you'd have a verdict, and then when it was a black person, you get a different verdict for, say, the same crime. Or when they come before the court for their rights, saying, look, we want our rights to be respected, no for one group and always yes for the other. This is structural. There's something wrong with this system. The system is constructed in a sort of way to keep this one group of people, or maybe many groups of people, down. That's what's structural. And it will use violence to do it. It will use violence to do it. You get in our way, we'll lynch you. We'll bomb your house. Okay, we'll burn a cross on your front lawn to terrorize you. We'll just outright kill you in some other way. There's actual violence. So the violence is built into the structure. And that's where I think what the people are getting at and talking about when they use this term structural violence. Okay? The effectiveness of structural violence lies in the fact of the threat of direct violence against you if you get out of line, if you try to overturn the structure that is oppressing you. If that's the case, my question is it not just physical violence under another name? Are we not just talking about violence, collective violence, but just giving it another name, calling it structural violence? Why not just say, well, it's collective violence? But I do think that when I think about it long and hard enough, I do think that you have examples, historical examples, U.S. slavery being one example, say Nazi Germany being another obvious example, but any kind of dictatorship, okay, where the whole structure is built on this threat of violence, that you go along with what we want, even if it's not in your interests, even if it's oppressing you, otherwise we will kill you, we will physically harm you. So violence is present. Okay, I already mentioned that. So. Causes of violence. What are some of the causes of violence? The World Health Organization lists 5. Okay? The first cause of violence is this: poverty, poorness, being poor. Why do I have it in all caps and it's bold and it's underlined? Because it's important. Poverty is linked with all forms of violence. And I'll give you a definition of poverty in a moment, but I think you know what I mean by it. It's when you lack the things that you need. Could be money, could be food, could be work, but you lack the basic necessities. Okay? And again, I'll repeat it. Poverty is linked with all forms of violence. So it is the number 1 cause for violence. Other causes are social isolation. So I put it all the way up there. Okay, you're socially isolated. You don't have any friends. You don't have anyone to talk to. You don't have a support structure. When it's just you talking to yourself without having anyone to kind of maybe bounce your crazy ideas off of, like, yeah, Bob, I was thinking of going down and shooting up the place. No, John, you really don't want to do that. That's a bad idea. Let's go out and have a drink or something, or maybe not a drink. Let's go out and, I don't know, go bowling. But not bowling for Columbine. You know what I'm saying? Wink, wink. Social isolation is a cause of violence because a person feels like they're not being listened to, they're not understood. And they also don't have that other voice and voices to maybe tell them that, there are other options than violence. Matthew. What's another cause? Another cause are cultural norms. If you live in a violent culture, yes, when I lived in Papua New Guinea for 9 months, and I am by no means an expert on the people or the country, but just, it was obvious. I mean, it was obvious very quickly after you got there that, violence was a cultural norm. When a person felt dishonored by a member of another tribe, usually the first response was a violent one. You would come up to someone from your tribe, not even the person maybe that the violence was done towards or the dishonor was done towards, but dishonor to one member of a group was dishonor to the whole group. So another person might hear of it and be like, okay, I see you. I know you dishonored the member of my group. And so they come up with a machete or something and they just slash you. Not kill you, but slash you, slit you, just to let you know that it's on, It's on. And that's how you get into tribal wars. They happen all the time in Papua New Guinea. People seem to be burning down other people's homes and sometimes it's because of rumors on Facebook, because now social media has gotten into them. I mean, these people, a lot of them are dirt poor, but they all have cell phones. And somehow they all want Facebook accounts. And all one person has to do is put up some story on Facebook about, I'm a member of the Chimbu tribe and a member of the, Popandetas did this to me. It might not even be true. Who knows? The next day, someone from Popandeta, a person they know is from the Popandeta tribe or that area, has his house burned down. And he doesn't know why necessarily. So these are always issues in Papua New Guinea, or PNG as it's simply called. Cultural norms can be a cause of violence, definitely. Alcohol and drug abuse, obviously, because when you're overdoing drugs and alcohol, your mind might not be in the right place. You might have a very distorted view of reality, and your impulse control might be a lot less. And then again, another very obvious one I would think for us Americans is access to weapons. When will we figure that one out? I don't know. And weapons doesn't necessarily mean guns. I mean, if you go over to, like the United Kingdom, then where they have very strict gun laws, then you don't have to worry so much about getting gunned down in the street, but you might have to worry about getting stabbed or slashed or something like that. But, I would imagine that it's far more difficult to do a mass shooting at a high school with a butcher knife, if you know what I'm saying. I don't know that you can pile up the bodies trying to stick people with a knife than if you show up with a machine gun. But weapons, wherever there are weapons, anywhere in the world, is a cause of violence because they're there. Especially if they're easy to get, then they're there for people to use. Research shows that previous exposure to violence, and this might go into, where would this go under? Maybe cultural norms, I guess. But anyways, it's here, so I'll read it. But research shows that previous exposure to violence in the home is associated with being a victim or a perpetrator of violence later on. So, and I think I mentioned this earlier before in home environment when we talked about functional bases for violence. If your home environment is bad, yes, if someone is in a harsh, unloving, or neglectful home environment, that can make them a victim later on, but even more seriously, it can make a person be a perpetrator of violence, just because that's all they've known. That's the response that they know to the stresses of their life. So they become more antisocial. Doesn't mean they will. Again, this does not mean that it will happen, but there is a correlation with antisocial and aggressive behavior when they get older. Oh, whoop-de-doo. Oh, okay. I told you I had a definition for poverty. There's the definition for poverty: to be the state, the quality, I guess you say quality, I'd say the state of life or existence where you are lacking the usual and acceptable amount of material needs. That is poverty. You lack what you need, basically. And it comes from the Latin word pauper, which comes from two words, paucus and pario, which means to bear little or to bring forth little, to produce very few things. Or or if you want to put it this way, paucus means little or few, and pario means to carry. Like a woman carries a child or carries a baby. So you're carrying few things. So if you can carry just a few things, you must be poor. You don't have a lot of things in your arms that you're carrying. You carry just a few things. So that's where the word pauper comes from and how we got our word poor. You don't have enough stuff. Whoops. Cat hair. Black cat hair. My Halloween cat. All right, so what does this tell us about religion and violence, Dr. Dunn? Hopefully it tells us something. Note well that nowhere does the World Health Organization identify religion as one of the risk factors for violence. Isn't that interesting? And I looked at a number of documents. I mean, I had, I think, 2 different WHO documents here that I mentioned. There's another one that I don't know if I had it here with me. I read it on my own, or read through it on my own. It was about violence. Let me just quickly see if I stapled it in here with everything else. These were not all the readings for the course, but I had some other things I want to look at too. Let's see. I don't think so. I must have put it into recycling. All right. I don't see it going. Nope, not here. Yeah, so it's either, well, it's certainly at home, either in my recycling or probably in my, no, I know where it is. I was trying to save all the stuff that I read. It's in my, in a drawer. But anyways, there was another World Health Organization document that I just read through sections. It was about violence, and I read through sections. And one of the sections, the only section I could find that dealt with religion in this document dealt with religion and suicide, and was talking about how religion can be helpful and is a good indicator. Where a place is religious, it's in the type, and sometimes the type of religion can be a good indicator of the levels of suicide. So, for example, if you have a religion like, say, Christianity or Islam, which are very clear about the sinfulness or the evil of committing suicide, then you usually found lower rates of suicide than in other religions like, say, Buddhism. Or atheism. They found that in countries where religion was actively discouraged, they found that there were high levels of suicide. Places like in Eastern Europe and stuff like that. So that was interesting. But nowhere, anywhere does the World Health Organization identify religion as one of even the risk factors for violence. Isn't that interesting? And yet we seem to hear all the time about, oh, it's just so obvious. It's taken as for granted that religion is a perpetrator of violence. That's what you have to look for. Is the person zealously religious? Are they a believer? Well, then you got to watch out. You don't know what they might do. Keep them away from the nuclear power plants. You know what I'm saying? You don't know what they might do. Although I don't know if you heard this in the news, but did you hear about North Korea just shot up a whole bunch of extra rockets the other day? Long-range rockets, and eventually they're probably, I don't know if they've put nuclear warheads on them yet, because they do have nuclear capability in North Korea, this tiny country of North Korea. But it's an atheistic regime. It's almost religious. It's a quasi-religious cult in a way, where they worship this one family. The Kim Jong-il, the Kim family is their last name. Kim Song-un, I think, is or Song-un Kim, if you want to put his family name last, is, I think, the head now. But I mean, they're virtually worshipped. I mean, it's a fascinating place if you want to study it from a religious studies perspective, because in North Korea, for example, even how the newspapers, if the newspaper has a picture, their local newspaper has a picture of the national leader, Kim Song-un, or any of them, his father and grandfather, Kim Jong-il, and I forget the name of the other guy, you cannot fold the picture. That's considered a desecration. You have to make sure that the newspaper is not folded with the picture. It has to have the full picture. And it's the same thing if you're a tourist there. They have statues and pictures of these guys all over the place. You know, one guy is considered the founder of modern North Korea, of the nation of North Korea. And then you have his son, who was dictator until his death, and now you have the guy's grandson. And if you take pictures of them, if you see a picture going by, you can't just take a picture halfway. You have to take a picture of the whole thing. Because if you cut any member of them out, any member of the group out, it's again seen as a desecration. It's fascinating it's almost like its own religion in North Korea, how they worship that family. It's almost like worship. Anyways, how did I get off onto that? But still, they are atheists. They are a communist regime in North Korea. They actively discourage religion. They only recently, in the past maybe 10 or 15 years, allowed them to open a Catholic cathedral, which still I don't think has any priest or bishop, but they've got the building. They've got this one building in Pyongyang, the capital. I don't know how many people go there, but it's kind of like a show, just to show them that they have religious freedom, which they really don't. But they have nuclear weapons. But it's religious people you need to be worried about, of course. You need to worry about them getting nuclear weapons, Muslim extremists who will blow us up, with a dirty bomb or something. But apparently the World Health Organization doesn't think religion is apparently that big of a risk factor for violence, because it's not there. Instead, there are all kinds of other things that motivate someone to violence first. May religion motivate a person? Yes, I think so. But there are other things first that seem to motivate. And the most influential and primary motivator is poverty. people being just poor and hopeless. Not that there's anything wrong with being poor. I'm poor, for the most part. I'm New Jersey poor, okay? I'm not like, well, I'm just saying, it's not like some really poor country that, there are poor countries in the world. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to get anyone angry. But, there are places in the world that have a lot more poor people than normal. So I understand that I'm blessed, but it's not like I know what it means to have your electricity turned off or have no heat in the winter, if you know what I'm saying. Or to have your home condemned, stuff like that. So I have a little bit of an understanding of poverty, okay? So what role does religion play? Okay, religion becomes a motivator, I think, that to the extent that it gives voice to or crystallizes a person's previous feeling of hopelessness or anger. Also, if you have pre-existing cultural norms that could drive, then those could also drive the religious thrust of a violent act. Okay? And what do I mean? I have to remember what I meant when I wrote that down. Because does that make any sense? No, it makes sense, but I just have to tease it out of my brain. Like, okay, Dr. Dunn, what were you thinking when you're sitting there with your cup of coffee, trying to expatiate? Well, you have the previous cultural norms that will take a religious impulse and can then also force it in the way that it goes. So, for example, when I was talking about the tribal wars in Papua New Guinea and PNG, that can very easily become religious between Catholics or Protestants, or Catholics and just non-Catholics, any group of people like tribal religionists. That could easily happen, especially if you see your religious group as your group, your tribe, and they're not just attacking, they're attacking now, you're a Catholic, and Bob down the street's a Catholic, and they burned his house down, so now you're going to go burn their house down. And so now religion enters into the mix. But religion was not necessarily the source of the problem, but it becomes part of the mixture of the cultural problem, which is to respond violently to something. Access to weapons provides that temptation to escalate the disagreement. It may not be a religious disagreement, or there may be a religious disagreement, but when you have access to weapons, it can escalate that disagreement or that conflict to a violent one. And you don't necessarily need religion for these things to happen, okay, once weapons are involved. In fact, you might need very little reason to solve your problem with violence through a weapon if a weapon is available. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Christopher Hitchens' book, which hopefully you've read that chapter, Religion Kills, in his book entitled God is Not Great. I have to say I was somewhat disappointed by it. I mean, I've been wanting to read his book for a while, and or at least read sections of it. Maybe I'll get it on like MP3 or something and listen to it, instead of having to read it. But the chapter was somewhat disappointing to me because he actually seemed to argue against himself. His whole idea was that religion is a menace to civilization, religion poisons everything, religion kills, which is the title of the chapter. And yet every example that he gave seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong, but if you've read it, you can correct me, seemed to be a political problem, like Irish Catholics, who, yes, they're Catholics, that's a religious group, but they were being oppressed and were oppressed by the British Protestant government of Northern Ireland. I mean, their civil rights were denied them for centuries, not just for like a little period of time, for centuries. And finally, in the last 100 years, they had enough, okay? They wanted to separate and to reunite with the rest of Ireland. Well, that's apparently not going to happen. Britain still has control and will not give up control of Northern Ireland, I don't think. But I mean, the military was in charge. for the most part, in Northern Ireland back in the 70s and for a long, long time. And there were atrocities committed. Yeah, and I'm a Catholic too, but I don't see it so much as a religious conflict as that was a political thing. I see it more as a person of Irish ancestry, although I know I'm not really Irish. I'm an American Irish, Irish American. And believe me, someone from Dublin will be the first to tell me that I don't know Ireland. That's true, because I lived there for 9 months as well. So even though my ancestors are from there. But that's how I see it. And other examples he gave the example of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, right there, Israeli is not a religious term. It's a country, okay? And not all Israelis are Jews. You have Arabs who are Israelis, okay? Arab Muslims who are Israelis. Arab Christians who are Israelis. The majority of people, yes, are of the Jewish ethnicity. Not all of Jewish Israelis practice Judaism. There are atheists who would still say they're Jews. And the same thing with Palestinians. Not all Palestinians are Muslims. Okay, there are Palestinians who are atheists. There are a lot of Palestinians who are Christian. There are a lot who are Muslim. So, and in the book, Hitchens talks about a talk he went to from a guy. In fact, I forget the guy's name. I got it highlighted. Here it is. I once heard the late Abba Eban, one of Israel's more polished and thoughtful diplomats and statesmen, give a talk in New York. And he was talking about the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. From this he went on to say, he's talking to this group, and with the authority of a former foreign minister and United Nations representative, his essential point was a simple one. Two peoples, meaning the Israelis and Palestinians, of roughly equivalent size, meaning millions of people, had a claim to the same land. Okay. And as I'm reading down, that sounds like a political conflict to me. That they both want the same land. They both claim this as their ancestral land. But then by the next page, he gets to the fact that somehow he's blaming Christians for wanting to bring on the end of the world. And then after that, he's saying religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. Well, I will admit to you that the Christians he's mentioning, and I am a Christian, so I am biased on it, but that they are a problem. They're making the situation worse. But did they create the situation? In his book, or the chapter we read, he gives example after example of political disagreements that have been made worse by religion, yes, by injecting religious elements into them. But the problem for Hitchens is that he then goes and blames religion for the pre-existing conflict that it didn't create. Yes, it made it worse. People started appealing to things that really mattered to them at their core, and so it made the situation worse and messier. But religion was kind of pulled into, from my perspective, from his examples, his own examples. I'm not making these examples up. It seemed to me like religion was pulled into them. It seems that each of these risk factors, poverty, cultural norms, social isolation, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, access to weapons, these risk factors would seem to be more determinative of how religion is used, could be used, or brought into play. It doesn't seem like religion itself is the actor causing any one of these situations, like poverty or social isolation. It's not causing it, but social isolation you can almost like adding ingredients to something you're baking, you know? You have the recipe, you add another ingredient, and poof, you have something different. You have an explosion, maybe. Maybe chemistry class is a better example. So religion isn't necessarily the primary actor in the situation, but it could be part of it that's making it worse. And in many religions, there are limits to these risk factors. So, for example, religion provides community. So that's an antidote to social isolation. It also provides a community that can help people, that can give them employment services, that can give them money when people need help. So that's also taking care of poverty. It's not curing poverty or removing it, but it's helping people get out of their poverty or their social isolation. It gives a contrary message. One of the readings we have coming up, or maybe now, I give you a reading, famous reading from Jesus of Nazareth, his famous Sermon on the Mount. Where, throughout the whole reading, it's not hard to see. Jesus talks about loving enemies. That if a person slaps you, commits violence to you by slapping you in the face, that you should allow them to slap the other side of your face. Now, whether Jesus meant that literally or not is another question, but I think at least the metaphor is clear, that the response should not be violence. Now, how do you explain that? It seems that in some cases, religion is providing a limiting experience to the response of violence. You could also talk about the 5 precepts of Buddhism. There are 5 precepts for a Buddhist. There are the 5 kind of laws that a Buddhist, a really dedicated Buddhist, is supposed to live by. I have to remember what they all are, but I know that one of them is not speaking lies. One is not harming other living creatures. Another is not getting intoxicated or by alcohol or drugs. Another is not misusing sex. And I forget what the 5th one is. There's always one I forget. But anyway, but I think you get the point. Look at the actions. I got you, my friend. Look at the actions that religion, Buddhism, and the 5 precepts are limiting: lying, harming other people sexually, harming yourself through drugs and alcohol. It seems to be doing the opposite, or preaching an opposite message than what I think we sometimes hear about what religion is there to do, or at least Hitchens is saying. Okay. Good to see you all. I will see you next week. Have a good week. All right. Okay. Bye, miss. Have a good week, miss. You too. Thank you. You too, sir. Good weekend. Okay. See you. Marquez. Steve Campbell. Have a good weekend. Yes.
Justicia again?
Justitia.
Yeah.
Justitia comes the Latin word jus, which means something that is binding, that you're obligated to do. It forms the basis of this word for justice, justitia. So justice, or justitia, is to give something you're obligated to give something, to give to someone what they are obligated to have, to give someone his or her due. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Well, I stutter over myself and...
No, I mean, like, you know what I mean. Because I'm explaining something like all the time, I understand that. I always make fun of that. Because I'm explaining something and I'm like, so random stuff, I have no idea, and then she'll be like, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? I'm like,
No.
No, I get it. I have no idea.
Well, the problem is sometimes I don't know what I mean. I don't know. That's where the problem comes in.
Like, yeah, sure.
Okay, you too. Okay, so let me turn this off.